Well, welcome to this iteration of our annual symposium. I have to say it is a deep pleasure to be able to introduce Dr. Robin Mansell as our opening keynote speaker today. I have known Robin for many, many years. We've crossed paths at conferences and governance events of one sort or another, and she'll be a superb contributor, I think, to what we're here to think about and to talk about today. She is the Professor Emerita in the Department of Media and Communications at the London School of Economics and Political Science. She's also currently the Scientific Director for the Observatory on Information and Democracy for the Forum on Information and Democracy, headquartered in Paris. As a former president of one of our major professional associations, the International Association for Media and Communication, Robin's been active in many, many law and policy-related organizations and conferences. She was elected a Fellow of the British Academy in 2022. I have a lot more things that I could say about Dr. Mansell, but I did want to highlight that she has always been involved throughout her career in addressing issues arising from new media technologies, and that gives her, I think, a special purchase on understanding and thinking through some of the dilemmas associated with artificial intelligence. Regulation and governance have been at the forefront of her concerns. She's, of course, authored numerous books, many journal articles, and has had numerous appearances, especially in the wake of a report that she'll at least mention, I think, that she produced for the Forum on Information and Democracy. She was most recently in Helsinki talking about that report. And then finally, I want to note that she has academic credentials in social sciences and a bachelor's degree in engineering, which I highlight because part of our effort at Good Systems has been to bring technologists together with humanists and with social scientists. And Robin Mansell embodies all of those ethical frameworks and sets of training as well. So let me welcome to the stage Dr. Robin Mansell.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm delighted to be here. My face always goes red when people read out what I've done with my life. I hope it all comes to fruition now in the next 40 minutes or so. As Sharon said, some of what I am going to talk about today is derived from a big report, which was called Information Ecosystems and Troubled Democracy, which I led with a civil society organization. It was a big effort over 3 years. It drew on research from the Global South, the Global North, involved about 155 civil society organizations, 55 governments, and more. So part of what I'm going to say is informed by that knowledge that we brought together and published. But I'm also going to draw on my own thinking about things related to AI. And here's just a very quick outline of the way I want to address the topic. And you see there some scales. Those are intended to be, can you hear me? Scales of justice. And we'll see throughout the talk, a constant theme is going to be, in terms of the developments that are happening now and into the future, who are the winners and who are the losers and why and what can be done about it. And so in that sense, I hope that this will resonate with your interest in what is good AI. So let's start with what is AI. One of the things we grappled with when we were trying to do a global report with people coming from many, many different backgrounds, traditions, was what can we understand by AI? And I'm not going to read out to you the formal OECD definition, which I'm sure all of you will be familiar with. But what we did come across very frequently was scholars and practitioners coming along saying we need to rename AI for a whole variety of reasons. One renaming exercise comes from Davina Frau-Mengs, who is a French scholar who's been trying to influence UNESCO to change the way it talks about AI. And she says, call it what it is. If you're talking about systems for statistical propositions and pattern recognition, you should call it that, not artificial intelligence. Milton Mueller who is a US-based scholar who works on governance, has very strongly, just recently published a paper maintaining that we should abandon AI altogether and call it integrated digital systems or ecosystems, covering the whole digital stack, which you can see there on your right. In our report that we did, we came to the conclusion that there really is no AI. What there is machine learning technologies. There are algorithms that are in use today, and there are deep learning algorithms and machines which are also in use today and will grow in the future. So what should we talk about? How can we communicate with each other? So today I will talk about AI, because otherwise we'll get ourselves tangled up in all sorts of knots. But I just wanted to start with that emphasis on the fact that we need to be really clear when we're talking about these systems of what exactly are we talking about. And part of the reason for that is in reviewing the literature, and we reviewed more than 150 journals throughout a 3-year period, most definitions are highly technically tech-centric. And in contrast, it seems to me that a more productive way to encounter these systems, of which AI systems are a part, is to think of systems being comprised of people, practices, values, and then and only then technologies that are configured in different social, cultural, political, and economic contexts. Now that sounds quite simple, but when you think about all of the tech hype and all of the tech push that is about, if you start with people rather than the technology, you often see something quite different. We can also understand these systems as involving complex interdependencies, quite often power relations between asymmetrically positioned actors, and this matters when we try to understand what the present and the future will bring in terms of people's interests and corporate interests. You will all be familiar with AI expectations on the left. I'm not going to run through those. Nothing I say today should be conveyed as being against progress in technology and the major benefits which come from the application and development of these systems. But what we do need to think about is the fact that because many actors are not first and foremost concerned with responsible AI, they're concerned with money. They're concerned with business models which are designed to make profit. And so AI developments are entangled with oligarchic practices. And this matters because the deployment of these systems all too often is central to the kind of information spaces we inhabit, mis and disinformation, to the weaponization of information and the destabilization of democracies, to a whole variety of biases and discriminations, to the erosion of privacy, to potential job displacements, and to cyber threats to critical infrastructure. So there is reason to be concerned. I thought I'd throw in a little bit of theory because I think it helps to reinforce the fact that we should not start with technology, we should start with social systems. And so we can go right back to Joseph Schumpeter, who many of you will know as an economist who was mainly concerned with markets. But if you read the footnotes in some of his work, you find out pretty quickly that his view was that tastes, preferences, growth, and innovation interact and mutually condition each other. Remember what I just said about interdependent systems? And that historic changes, when we look back to how we got where we are today, are very much about other social factors. And these determine what innovation is about in the technical sphere. And by social, he meant political as well here. And the other influential piece of theory which bears on innovation and the kinds of challenges we face today that I think is instructive is a lot of the work on futures. There's a huge amount of work today on future technological systems. And that is informed by Christopher Freeman, who was a British scholar who worked in this area. People in the US would be Richard Nelson, for example, would be a key figure who had something very similar to say. And these scholars insist that when we try to think about the future, where these systems are going, for good or ill, it's impossible to see the future with any kind of certainty, precisely. It's only possible to envisage various alternative possibilities and to take action. And I really want to stress the alternative possibilities, because far too often we kind of are made to believe, some of the time, that the future is determined, that it will be more of the same. The trajectory of technological innovation will continue along a single path, and that alternatives are just simply not available. That thinking needs to be put to one side. Because today, what we see is when a lot of the big tech companies talk about something called responsible innovation, a lot of the time they try to diffuse responsibility away from social groups and decision makers and say, well, if everybody is responsible for making decisions, from the engineers to the politicians, et cetera, then in a sense, no one is responsible. And therefore, it is kind of a recipe for inaction. The quote there is from Nick Clegg when he was responsible for public affairs at Meta. And on the other hand, these same companies are very interested in attacking anyone who seeks to intervene to protect people from the harms that are associated with artificial intelligence. And so most recently, as many of you will be aware, big tech, and Meta in particular, has accused European legislators of institutional censorship, misrepresenting the actions that are designed to restrict speech legally and proportionally on social media systems, which of course are driven by algorithms. And we have all sorts of instances, which I won't go into detail about, where big tech is using their algorithms in political contexts, which are highly controversial, and trying to exercise US authority overseas. So all of that adds up to huge tensions on a global level. Most recently, debates about AI safety or good systems versus AI security has been a major issue. We know that UN organizations are discussing and publishing many, many principles about good practice in the development of AI systems. We know that the OECD is doing the same. The recent AI Action Summit in Paris a month ago came up with some very favorable language. AI should be open, it should be inclusive, transparent. All of these adjectives, which I don't think any of you would disagree with. However, the US and the UK did not sign up to this. Why did they not sign up? Well, it depends on who you talk to. But the major reason is because they are principally concerned with a race to develop advanced technologies in this area. So basically what we confront here on a global basis, and I would argue also within countries, including the US, is conflicts, major conflicts over values. Values, whether they be, on the one hand, human rights, and on the other hand, corporate values. The Universal Declaration on Human Rights, of course, says that everyone has the right to freedom of opinion and expression. How many people actually also quote at the same time the fact that Article 29 says that proportionate limitations are justifiable if the ambition is to respect the rights of others, not just the speaker, but the rights of others. So it's in this kind of context, excuse me, where with the diffusion of AI systems, the take-up of algorithms throughout all sectors, we are seeing more and more efforts to try to combat mis and disinformation. And in our study, the basic conclusion was that when these measures do infringe on speech rights and they are not transparent or independent and accountable, then yes, it does make sense to call them censorship. But in other cases, they're not censorship. They are measured interventions aimed at balancing, if you like, human rights with corporate values. And so the disputes that we're seeing around AI for bad or for good are not just about whether or not these systems propagate more bad stuff online or whether they're discriminatory. They're also really signaling a deep, deep dissensus around the societal values which should underpin technological innovation. And it's there that the real challenge exists. When we think about what the big technology companies and at least some, not all government, priorities really are, we hear a familiar refrain. Aims are to increase competitiveness and national or regional economic growth based on the monetization of data and the promotion and development of AI. A second claim is that technological accelerationism is always good for humanity. No questions asked. A third claim is that online interaction enabled by AI generates raw or neutral data that belongs to no one until someone appropriates it, and the appropriators are usually the big tech companies. And fourthly, that big tech and or states should be the ones in a position to determine what content or information circulates, what can be removed and why. This is the normal litany that you hear, and it is backed up by some pretty big players and influential investors like Peter Thiel, who some years ago said monopolization is good. It's not all about competition, it's about monopolization. Competition is for losers. So, when we undertook our study, we were particularly interested in a range of issues, not just AI, but also trust in information, trust in the news, as well as data governance. And what we found strikingly was that the evidence base we have on how the world is changing as a result of the diffusion of AI and algorithms is that impacts like polarization of public opinion depend on multiple factors, not just on the design and affordances of the technologies. We find enormous diversity in the effects of the use of AI tools for content moderation, for example. We also find that from the citizens' or users' point of view, globally, although many, many people report trust in news most of the time, 40%. This comes from Reuters surveys. We find diversity, whereas where Finland, for example, is quite high, United States quite low. In the OECD area, a recent survey shows that 40% of people believe that governments will regulate AI appropriately, same percentage for climate change. And then we find the highest, Switzerland, Finland, Mexico, the lowest, Czechia, Ireland, UK. US did not participate. But the point here is not just that there is enormous variability, but also that we don't actually know and pay enough attention to what I would call the politics of locationality. In other words, location, location, location matters. Cultures matter. Politics matters. They're not the same all over the world. And therefore, any risks of AI are going to be experienced differently, depending on who you are, where you are, what resources you have to draw upon. And we really don't have, in the research literature, studies that make clear what the different constellations or combinations of factors are that make a difference in terms of what the impacts of AI actually are. An interesting phenomenon is the extent to which, it comes back to the tech push idea, a lot of the thinkers about what are the impacts of AI, such as the World Economic Forum, who does their global risk surveys, position AI-driven mis- and disinformation and cyber espionage and warfare as technical issues. Other things are seen as social. Other things are seen as political. But even those who are most concerned about risk mitigation see these as segmented issues where technology comes first, not the social or the political. And so from our reviews of policy and the research literature on policy making in this area, what we find more and more is that AI innovation is positioned over and over and over as a necessary push to turbocharge development of various kinds, with policy being way too much focused on information and technology itself, instead of on the actors, their experiences, their everyday lives, and their motivations for good or ill. We also find that content moderation is not effective when the underlying business model continues to be monetize data and make money as the highest priority. We find that democratic instability and harms to adults and children will continue unless governments take action, but then governments are charged with institutional censorship when they do take action. So it's a very difficult set of choices to make. And we find in the literature that the evaluation of interventions when they are made to protect from harms of AI, risk mitigation measures, actually have relatively small impacts. And so if we stay with the current design and affordances of the big tech's view of how AI should be developed and introduced in society, we're going to have smallish impacts in terms of rebalancing between their interests and the public. We also find in the literature that there's far more research, relatively speaking, on trying to predict the impacts of AI. Study after study after study tries to predict the impacts on individuals, assuming that the harms will be overcome soon, sometime. And yet, recall what I said about predictions? Predictions are always uncertain. They ought to provide an opening to think about alternatives. Policymakers express constantly in different forums where I've been, and I'm sure many of you have been, about the speed of change and about the fact that AI innovation has kind of come along and blindsided them. But when you really think about it, and when you think about digital ecosystems or information ecosystems more generally, many of the approaches to regulation and governance are very similar to what we have seen in the past. It's not so much the AI that's new, it's the fact that people are reacting to it as if it was new and not drawing on the history of the ways in which countries have legislated in the past. So there's a huge fixation, for example, and I'm sure all of you have looked at it, the European Union's AI Act or the Digital Services Act, as if this was somehow new. It's not. It is efforts to try to intervene to ensure that that balancing of values between the corporate and human rights can be made better. So all in all, top-down approaches from governments are being, around the world, variably enforced, and it really depends on local, regional, and global political pressures, just exactly what the outcomes are likely to be. So predicting AI impacts, which is the major approach of many research traditions, is not entirely helpful. And basically, and this is going to sound a little bit simple, what we can conclude is that AI innovation is troubling for democracy, but we don't have certainty in terms of empirical results to back that up. What we can say is that disputes about AI will contribute, about whether AI will contribute to the generation and circulation of responsible content and decision-making or override responsibility and ethics will be ongoing, and therefore these developments must be troubling for democracy. What we can say also is that it seems very clear that these AI systems amplify wider changes in society and social values, cultures, politics, and economies, which is where I started. When we think about whose voices are being heard in the research literature and in policy forums, what we see over and over again is what you might call an epistemic privileging of the few over the many, which is why I titled my talk about oligarchs. So whose voices are really being heard? Mainly, it is the big tech promoters of finance, investment, and the voices of those who are concerned about human rights and human dignity, or good AI, are far less present in some of the discussions. But even when they are heard, the balancing, an even balancing between these different interests is simply not being achieved as a result of the top-down measures. And so what I would suggest to you is that this isn't just a matter of prohibiting certain types of AI applications that the EU, for example, would say are high risk. What it is a matter of is expanding the capacity for bottom-up resistance strategies, which are able to think through alternatives. And so the question is, how are we doing in that area? This brings us towards real questions about what would responsible AI and data justice really look like? And how do we go about it? You here have 5 years of conferences on community efforts, etc. More generally, what I would say is we need far more attention to how do we go about unpacking the power dynamics that reinforce the inequities, the imbalances between human rights and the oligarchs' interests. How do we structure institutions and organizations to engage politically, sometimes in parallel to the top-down measures that are being taken, sometimes in resistance against them, or even separately from the formal policy and regulatory forums? How do you organize to resist dependency on tech products that are owned and controlled by big tech? In other words, how do you mobilize bottom-up types of strategies? And so in our work across the globe, basically, we came across lots and lots of instances of bottom-up resistance strategies which are intended to imagine or reimagine what the technological ecosystem could look like, different from today. We found individual self-defense strategies using VPNs, very simply. We found numerous efforts to invest in public interest alternative news media, not all alt-right, some alt-left. We found lots of examples of community strategies being hosted by indigenous communities, particularly around language issues and the use of AI. We found, partly thanks to Sharon, many instances of smart city municipal initiatives which are being redesigned from the bottom up rather than the top down in order to protect people's data and information. Also found many, many community-controlled technologies and data practices, and many instances of open and commons-based governance frameworks for data and the way AI is developed and used. That was all very interesting, but basically what we found is strings of case studies. What we didn't find was a lot of interconnectivity between them. And now I'm not just talking about within the United States, or within Canada, or Britain, or the EU. I'm talking about including countries in the global south. We found very little that would help us to understand how these can scale up, how they can stop being defeated by stop-go funding, which somehow dissipates. You just get going, and all of a sudden it stops, and then what do you do? So overall, our findings were very strongly in the direction of putting more effort into these bottom-up resistance strategies of all kinds to try to understand how they can be interconnected, how they can be used to reflect on the diversity of the ways in which people experience tech innovation and AI in particular, and how they can be positioned to not, as soon as they get going, be bought up by the latest big tech company who comes along and says, oh, that's a good idea, we'll just buy that up and then we'll put it out of business, or we'll corporatize it. So, in terms of lessons, if we really want to think about what research communities can do to enable better evidence-based policy on AI innovation, we need to think about both research designs and methods, but also under-researched topics. And here again, I'm drawing on this massive global report where these are the key insights that came out of it. The first, on the research design and methods side, was really that we need insights into both the affordances, the characteristics of the technological systems we're talking about. We need to be specific about what we're talking about. And we need to couple that, not separate it, from research on what states, companies, and other actors are doing. In other words, we need interconnectedness. A lot of social scientists say we need holistic research. Of course, as soon as you say we need holistic research, everybody collapses and says, yes, but that's expensive or it's impossible. We can't do everything at once, and that is true. I happen to believe that. But I also think that we could do more to join up research that is on the governance regulatory side and the bottom-up initiatives with design and practice and technological innovation. We also need more evaluation, more accountable and more independent evaluation of AI systems using real-world data that is gathered from the field. There are enormous numbers of studies which are basically experimental, and they are helpful, they are insightful, but they don't tell you about the everyday ongoing experience of the human beings who are interacting with these new systems. We also found over and over and over again claims that what needs to happen is studies of the whole life cycle of AI in diverse use and country contexts. And by whole life cycle, I mean everything from the early lab-based experiments with models, et cetera, making them much more transparent, to the use cases and the ways in which these technologies become part of every sector of society and the economy. We also found that it is incredibly important to tackle findings, whether it be on the impacts of AI, whether it be on mis and disinformation, based on findings from outside the global north, and particularly outside the US. The disproportionate amount of research, which is partly due to funding, that comes from this country, but also from European countries, compared to what we can learn from studies undertaken in the global south, is enormously disappointing. In our work over 3 years, we reached out consistently to researchers in countries in the global south. We still ended up with only 22% of our evidence coming from the global south, even after strenuous efforts. And finally, securing researcher access to data, which is something I'm sure all of you repeat to yourselves on a daily or weekly basis, is something which needs to be addressed if we are to make better contributions to evidence-based policymaking. And particularly sensitive now is the independence of researchers and their institutions to be able to undertake research which is not pushed in particular directions, and in addition, does not allow you to use certain turns of phrase, et cetera. And then in terms of the under-researched topics that we came across, the most under-researched was reimagining what data and AI governance could actually look like, the alternatives. And I'm sure all of you can come say, I know this paper, I know that paper. But we're talking here about a global effort to look at the relative balance between those who are thinking about promoting AI on the current trajectory and those who are thinking about doing something different, like I gather you're trying to do here at this university. The imbalance is enormous. The imbalance in research that looks both at human rights and freedoms and how they are impacted by structural inequalities and how those play out in terms of tech biases, whether those biases are to do with racial or ethnic minorities and marginalizations. But the research in that area is small compared to the amount of research that is interested in predicting the impacts of AI, where you do find out there are discriminations. But finding that out and actually understanding why they happen are two different things. Thirdly, looking not so much at predicting impacts of a particular tech system or product, but looking at how, as more and more people become included in information spaces which are driven by AI, the very inclusion is inequitable in itself. And so sometimes we think we get a win when we get people either connected, to put it simply, to the internet, or we have a win when we find that more kids in schools, for example, are able to use some version of generative AI. We think we have a win, but what we're finding in the literature, and this is global again, is a lot of inclusion washing, you might want to call it, a bit like greenwashing. In other words, steps are taken, investment is made, people are included, but there's no follow-up. There's no continuing follow-up and evaluation. Why? Not because people don't care, but because the money's not there. It's a structural problem of the way funding is organized. Of course, we need meaningful, and I mean meaningful, governance, transparency, accountability, and enforcement for the top-down kind of initiatives. The European Union is often targeted by American policymakers as introducing all sorts of complicated regulations, et cetera. But it also has to be recognized that much of that is implemented in all sorts of different ways across the EU member states, inconsistently. And that matters because that conditions what kind of experience people have in terms of the take-up of AI applications. And then finally, I didn't want to not mention media and information literacy and AI literacy. Here, quite often, for many governments around the world, this is seen as, well, if we can't do anything about AI and we can't do anything about the oligarchs, perhaps we can do something about individual literacy, people's critical literacies, their ability to navigate through these increasingly complex systems. And yes, much more needs to be done in that area, but it cannot be seen as the fallback, the only strategy. In other words, it needs to be complemented by studies of the structural conditions and the affordances of the technology as they're developing and of the alternatives. So finally, winners and losers in AI innovation. You see that I have the scales of justice there tipped towards the people. I don't wish to imply that the people are homogeneous, but I don't have room on the slide to put all different types of people. I've raised the scale to privilege the people because, as I've been arguing throughout this talk, the oligarchs and the state and private corporate interests seem, at least now, to be uppermost. And it would seem to me that rather than talking about the need to balance, which we have been talking about for decades as technologies have been developing, we always need to balance the interests of citizens, the interests of corporates. Of course we need to balance them, but we never do balance them. And insofar as we don't balance them, we need to give more effort and energy towards investment in strategies that will help with the rebalancing, with protecting human rights, with responsibility in whatever ways are possible. I put the map there, not necessarily to confuse you, but to make the point that these technical issues are not isolated. They underpin just about every area of crises which we are confronting across countries, across the globe, whether they have to do with climate change, whether they have to do with cyber threats, whether they have to do with mis and disinformation, or whether they have to do with the next generation of AI. In other words, they are interconnected. There's no escaping this. And yet, in our research traditions, so often we treat them as isolated issues. And I come back to you to insist on the fact that we need to be concerned with the interdependence of the social and the technological, that we need to understand asymmetrical power relations better than we do, because it is only in that way that we are going to be able to shift these scales of justice towards the people. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much for talking to us about your observations on this important subject and for giving us a little bit of the detail on this massive, impressive, and deep report that your team has put together. I was wondering if we could hear a little bit more about how the observatory report unfolded, what its goal was, and as you've gone around the world now talking about this report, what's the reception been?
Do I just talk? Or shall I use this?
Hold this. Yeah, just hold the mic.
Hello.
the ambition of the observatory, which was set up by the former Secretary General of the OECD and by Shoshana Zuboff, whose name should be familiar to you, was to do a IPCC, like climate change style report, which would serve as a benchmark, which would cut across media, AI, and data governance, and be inclusive of the global south and the global north, in order to see what is the state of the art across the social sciences and the sciences, including computer science. And so they hired me to help shape that endeavor, and it was a lot of work and a lot of controversy along the way, as you might imagine, people coming from different countries, different backgrounds. Anyway, we produced a report, and how is it being received? I think in some venues, I do a different kind of talk. I run through some of the results more systematically, and people go silent. They're just overwhelmed. So that's one reaction. Another reaction, if there's more time, especially from civil society actors, so we've been presenting it to many civil society actors, is they respond very positively and they want follow-up talks about how to go about some of the resistance strategies. The OECD, an example there is they're very, very interested. They see it as an interesting benchmarking exercise. But when I went to talk to them, they told me I couldn't use the term big tech because that would offend a delegation that should go nameless. And they didn't want to cause offense. So I was quite surprised by that. But overall, there has been a lot of interest. But it is a kind of report which clearly we stopped data collection in September 2024. It will be out of date before you know it because things move quickly. But I think it has depth in terms of addressing many of these different controversies and areas, and is helpful, I think, in helping people think about what should they think about next.
I thought that was turned off. Sorry. Well, that's an interesting segue to something I wanted to talk about a little bit. Some of the researchers in the United States have noticed the new changes in the standards and the language that the National Institute for Standards and Technology is grappling with. NIST is the closest thing the United States has to a regulatory entity. It really is not regulatory, but they set standards that industries are anxious to have. They would like to have some benchmarks. And when it comes to AI, they have been working on standards. And most recently, they've been asked to eliminate AI safety, responsible AI, and AI fairness from their language in the interest of reducing ideological bias. And ideological bias was the terminology in the official memo. So the new directive removes the mention of developing AI tools that would authenticate content, that would track its provenance, and the labeling of synthetic content as well. Is there a positive future with these restrictions? Is there a way that somehow from the laughter in the audience we can see that this will lead us in a productive direction?
No. One of the things we did was we looked at the lack of independence of researchers around the world when we were doing our report. And I think there was something like only 8 countries in the whole wide world who had a plus for independence of research. So many countries around the world have had an ongoing experience of what it is possible to say and what it is not possible to say. I think America has been singularly free up until recently. Although I know that in some industries, like the pharmaceutical industry or the tobacco industry, there have been major political pressures on researchers over time. Same in Canada. But I think now the conflation of the types of language you just mentioned, equity, fairness, etc., with ideology, is exactly what I was talking about, was that there is no sense of the civil being balanced with the corporate, or in this case, the government desire to win a race, come what may. And if that is the zeitgeist, then I don't think it can be good for researchers in this country, because we already know that there are instances before the election of the current administration where certain types of research were suppressed, whether it be about politics, etc. We know that researchers were losing their funding even before the executive directives and this recent announcement from NIST. So what can I say? The struggle goes on. And it's also possible to work with communities. I think this is something that really matters, who don't use the academic language. I mean, if you have a focus group with people who are worried about AI and they're thinking about the harms, and you ask them what do they think, how often are they going to use the nice sounding language of standards, etc.? They're going to talk about things, and it's their vernacular, which I think can be used in order to expose and to convey issues and problems, and then to work with designers, engineers, and to also try to influence some of the corporates who will listen. So my one-word answer was probably better than that. No.
Thank you. I really appreciated your final slide on the bottom-up strategies and the various locations of resistance. But I think in this country in particular, we often run into a problem in that our First Amendment has this language about government shall make no laws restricting the freedom of the press. And I often call that, as do many, a negative freedom. It's saying there shall be no laws affecting what goes on in that arena. What it doesn't say is that there will be affirmative measures to support the vitality of entities, you know, in that era, the press. If we were to try to update that, it would be the media, it might be other realms in which political expression, media expression can occur. Your strategies were all strategies that kind of we, on sort of the receiving end of things, could try to take. But I wonder where your strategies might wind up if we tackle more boosting institutions, and if we try to devise more institutionally focused measures.
Some of the strategies I was mentioning are actually institutional. In countries like, for example, Brazil and India, to just name two, there are major efforts being made to try to introduce institutional mechanisms and processes which will both enable greater diversity and plurality in the media, but also enable more transparency in terms of the ways in which AI actors are held accountable. So there is an institutional element. The frameworks for data governance that are being developed, which are commons-based, are also institutional in the sense that they often involve many different coalitions of actors. But if you mean how to influence the more conventional top-down institutions, which would standard-setting organizations, et cetera, I think the evidence-based research, which brings to light where inequities reside and doesn't always just try to predict impacts of technology, is one strategy towards that. Because all too often we go to policymakers and say, here's the impact, you should do something about it. Instead, it can go to them and say, here are some of the institutional mechanisms which are giving rise to these inequities in the first place. And it might be a little complicated, but you can bring together different ministries who need to address some harms and collaborate to develop new mechanisms and new processes. In the United States, of course, you may have the First Amendment that says that, but it only applies to some. We see now that a lot of pressure is on the media, so and it's coming from government.
Thank you. Thank you. In line with this, when you did your research, when you led the teams, as you already mentioned, you really worked hard to try to surface research situations from the global south and work from sources that often don't make it into the mainstream of Western research literature. I've seen enough of some of that research to wonder if you found in the global south, and I guess I'm thinking of Brazil in particular right now, some of the institutional responses that might be models for what other countries could do.
It's part of the reason why I was emphasizing the need for alternative imaginings of how things could be. We found not enough instances, and that was rather our problem. We didn't have the resources. Over time, because I work in this area, I know that there are many, many instances of new protocols, new policies, and being turned into practices. But what we do find throughout the Global South is a lack of resources. So, and there's also a big push back against colonization. So a big call for the decolonization of work. And how often, when you do, for example, a discourse analysis of policy documents in the Global South, do you find that a template has been introduced from the United States or from Britain or maybe the EU? And they themselves are trying to push back against that. So I don't think there's an easy reverse process whereby we can learn from what they are doing in the Global South. And the reason for that is that the institutional setup is different. I don't think you can just transplant from one place to another.
Thank you. And I'm looking at Stacy because I'm not sure exactly when to entertain other questions, but do I have time for one more question? Okay. And then I think we'll open it up, and hopefully you have some comments and questions. There's been some prominent press coverage here about that's critical of the approach in Europe with respect to companies, because there are risk frameworks and more affirmative governance that appears to be, from some perspectives, restricting research on artificial intelligence. And the claim is that that research is really inhibiting the ability of many countries and perhaps companies in those countries to make progress that's commensurate with what's going on in the United States. How do you evaluate that claim?
I know as many European researchers who are critical of what has been done in terms of the introduction of new legislation, and yet support it anyway. So at the political level and at the level of formal legislation, there is this push to try to balance between European values, whether it's AI or media, and corporate interests in developing the technology. And up to now, it seems to me that politically, it has been very much the ones who want to elevate European values. And so therefore, we find a lot of very complex legislation being put in place and some resources given to implementation, but it's uneven, as I said. Now, in the current geopolitical context, we see a big push to develop a new European stack with the claims that have been made over the last 30 years that we need to push back some of that regulation because it is stymieing the innovative spirit, you could say, investment in homegrown AI models, et cetera. And also in response to tariff wars. Where it's going to play out, I don't know, but I don't think that you will see the EU anytime soon letting go of its claim to European values. But I also think it will depend hugely on how their economies do. And I don't think that notion of EU leadership, at least now, in the AI space, is real. And I don't think the UK notion of AI leadership is real either. But they are posturing because they know that they are going to have to develop and use the technologies wherever they come from, whether China or the US. So I think it's a very mixed picture. It's a complicated picture. And what you see from outside the EU is this, look at all this edifice of legislation. Where's the evidence that it will slow down innovation or whether it will speed it up? We don't have any evidence. It's counterfactual.
Thank you for that. Are there microphones roaming around for people to use? There's one. Does anybody have a question or comment that you? Yeah, right down here in front. Thank you.
Hi, my name is Anupam. So for at least 30 years now, there has been this argument about a flat world, which has tried to promote equity and economics across the world. What do you think about those who are arguing that AI is similarly creating a flat world and creating equity and opportunity in different parts of the world? Would that be a fair argument, or what would be the challenges to really the good in whatever is being brought out by such arguments?
Wouldn't a flat world be interesting? I would only say that certainly the people I've been collaborating with would want to support those kinds of initiatives. But how they support them is the biggest challenge, because they need to be funded, they need the resources, they often are steered in many countries around the world, as I'm sure you know, by the diktats of the technology investors who come from outside the countries. And so you get into a bit of a do loop. Do you just go with the already commodified, commercialized technology and build on that? Or do you try to step aside and start differently? And in the AI space, that's incredibly costly. And what we see is people in many lower income countries becoming the laborers on behalf of the developers in the global north, which is a real problem. But working towards greater equity can only be good.
Another question or comment? Just one in the back.
I have a question. So I have a need and a fear, and I'd like to contrast those and see what we can do about satisfying the need without succumbing to the fear. So my need is for an AI assistant that follows me from job to job and learns from me in a way that increases my value to my employers and hence my compensation. My fear is that my employer will foist upon me an AI assistant that will learn from me and make me less valuable because the assistant can be given to a lower cost replacement for me. So what can we do to aid in policies that will encourage the former?
I think at the core of that dilemma is data governance and data protection, because the only way in which that AI assistant is going to be able to do the latter, the fearful thing, is if some entity is interested in accomplishing that and establishing an algorithm that does devalue and send outputs that do devalue you. So we need collaborative community type control over the data in the first place. And then and that can be used not only to train the models, but also to input into the models so that you get the feedback from employers, et cetera. I don't think there's an easy answer, but what it is not is a situation in which if the commercial providers of that tool or system are allowed to take the data and do what they will with it, then their incentives will be to go to the highest bidder, right? Or, replace you with technology and all the rest of it. In other words, we need transparency. It's not maybe a full answer, but that's what's necessary, is transparency and control over the data in the first place.
Another question? Okay, just a couple in the back.
Really inspiring talk, and I really appreciate the evidence-based research when the incentive to speak truth to power from a bottom-up perspective. And I'm wondering if you have advice how to apply that to the academic realm. So we've all been watching as the edict from the federal level and in the White House is making its way through granting authorities, and how quickly people who are applying for those grants, the PIs, are perhaps forced to fall in line with some of those mandates. And in speaking truth to power and in that bottom-up way, what options do we have? What advice do you have for us, whether we're students or whether we're seasoned academics? How can we fight back? Do you have kind of tangible examples of that?
I guess the first thing to say is it has to be a personal choice, because whole trajectories and careers depend upon being employed, getting your PhD, doing a postdoc perhaps, getting employed as a assistant professor, et cetera, promotion matters. And if certain kinds of types of research and publications are going to be deemed to be unacceptable, then it is a personal choice. But the struggles go on, and there are, in just about every country I know about, there are coalitions of researchers who try to work alongside civil society actors, quite often jointly, to be able to get their voices heard through other mechanisms. So through civil society organizations. I've been liaising with literally dozens of them in Europe, actually, over the last few months. And the enthusiasm they have for drawing upon research undertaken for them by researchers but not published through formal mechanisms is enormous. It's a huge appetite. And so that is one strategy, is to, it's always been difficult to balance between being an activist and being an academic, but I think now it's becoming almost imperative to wear two hats. And the hat that conforms as far as possible in order to maintain a job and be able to have an income to feed families, etc., is one thing. But on the other hand, there are other alternative mechanisms for getting our voices heard. It's not necessarily safe, but it is an alternative.
And
Hi, I was just wondering, thank you for your great talk. And you say something when you describe the bottom-up resistance, and you say, like, how can we scale up and grow? And I was just thinking, as someone who has been doing a lot of work in the Global South, perhaps that's exactly the opposite of what we should be doing. We should be hyper localizing things rather than scale up, because the scale up side of like artificial intelligence is that it assumes that it's universal and it's over encompassing and it's just one, usually coming from certain centers of power. So I was just wondering if you have any comment on that, on different epistemologies, not only to think differently about AI, but to actually thinking about alternatives entirely different than two technologies.
I take your point, and when I talked about scaling up, I really did have in my mind localization and scaling up horizontally, but within localities, and being more inclusive of more people, developing approaches which are community-based. I didn't mean kind of a global scaling up so that everybody's interconnected with everybody. I do think there's much learning that can go on if it's possible to exchange information about the disparate ways in which people are approaching these technologies and their development design. But I also know from many PhD students I've had that have worked in countries in the Global South just how difficult it is to stay on the side of doing the good thing, what people see as good, when the pressures are enormous to take an easier road, if you like, because some investor comes from outside and says, here, we'll do it for you. And then the commoditization process happens once again, and the values that are pertinent in the local place more or less are suppressed, and it's very hard to struggle back. So my comments on scaling up were very much meant as locational, the politics of location, rather than some sort of global scaling up. Thank you.
I understand we have time for just one more question. And Sylvia, I see you have the microphone in your hand.
it's just keeping this conversation about localization. I'm also from the Global South. I'm from Brazil, and I'm researching AI and journalism for 12 years now. And one of the things that I would like to hear from you is about the geographical disparity on the training data of these AI systems, because most of these training data are based on English language and data coming from global north, especially Western Europe and the US. And I do think that a conversation about diversifying these perspectives is really needed. And it's not diversifying just teams or debiasing just the output, like those alignments that we have, our LHF, but also thinking about what the training data is, because garbage in, garbage out, you know.
Well said. I couldn't disagree more. I think an interesting battle in that regard is going to be the whole copyright battle, because if, depending on which way it pans out, if the big global north developers of models get their way and are able to continue to scrape and use up more and more English language copyrighted material for training their models, the imbalance that you speak of is going to get worse. But if countries in the global south decide to actually enforce ownership and copyright on some of their content, they may be able to locationally use it to develop their own models, which are more linguistically diverse. Of course, the cost is huge. And, you know, I'm not sure, I don't know what Brazil is doing in that regard, but I think that there is a tipping point, if you like, that at some point, these big companies in the global north, and even some small ones that are trading on English language data, are going to start reaching out, because they're going to want to build their markets in other parts of the world. They're going to want to make money. And if they are not able to access that data, then somebody else will come along as it gets cheaper and cheaper. And we've seen in China, it can get cheaper to develop local models, which are trained on different languages and dialects and what have you. And so, you know, who knows? But at the moment, it looks a bit bleak, I would say.
Please join me in thanking Dr. Mansell.